Hello, everyone. I'm Trinh Wei. I'm Program Director for International Trade Research at the Heinrich Foundation. Thank you for joining us today as we introduce to you the Sustainable Trade Index. This is a major piece of joint research by Switzerland's IMD World Competitiveness Center and the Heinrich Foundation. It's essentially a ranking of 30 economies that represent 2/3 of the world by population as well as GDP, measured on economic, environmental, governance, and social factors. And these are not just indicators that are very basic, such as inflation and current account, but they're also quite complex modern concepts, such as modern slavery, goods at risk of modern slavery, and investment, and so on. Here today with me to explain the index and its policy implications are Christos Kabolis. Christos is chief economist for IMD's World Competitiveness Center, and he writes an illustrious resume, Yale, UC Santa Barbara, UNC, and he is one of the key architects, I would say, of this expanded index. With me as well is Steve Olson, and Steve writes just as pedigreed a resume. He is former US Commerce Department, former USTR, a former trade negotiator, and now he's a senior research fellow with the Heinrich Foundation. Christos is going to kick us off with an overview of what the Sustainable Trade Index is all about. Christos, do you want to introduce us to the index?
Yes, thank you very much, Trinh Wei. Greetings, everyone, from rainy Lausanne. As I wrote in the chat, it is a particular pleasure to be here and help you navigate through the Sustainable Trade Index. This is a co-created ranking between the Heinrich Foundation and the IMD World Competitiveness Center, and we are extremely intrigued and very excited to bring that to you. So what we try to do is essentially to measure the capacity and the readiness of 30 economies, as Trinh Wei said, to participate in the international trading system in a fair and sustainable manner. Very timely, the launching of this index. And as Trinh Wei said, there are 30 economies that are involved. Let me take you to the map. So you see, it is Asian-centric ranking, East, South Asia, Oceania, and Pacific countries. And you also get a glimpse of the ranking that we have with New Zealand first, then United Kingdom, then Hong Kong, Japan, and Singapore. How did we come up with these numbers? In fact, we collected 70 different indicators, which we grouped in 3 pillars that we feel are very important in what we try to show: the economic pillar, the societal pillar, and the environmental pillar. Let me take you through each one of them. So, economic pillar essentially tries to capture the ability of an economy to promote economic growth through international trade. Essentially tries to see whether an economy has the infrastructure necessary to support this trade growth. What do we deal with here? We deal with issues related to trade costs. We deal, of course, with issues related to inflation, very popular nowadays, but also indirectly with supply chains. We take into consideration investments, and we take into consideration, of course, tariff and non-tariff barriers, because we would like to see whether the economy is ready to embark in this trade growth. you see that the first two economies is Hong Kong and Singapore. And essentially, when we studied and analyzed the data, we found something very interesting. We found that the economies that actually are in the top positions in this pillar are actually economies that have very good trade infrastructure. They have an ease of conducting trade. That is, they are free trade economies. They're open. They have export diversification over two components. That is, the number of goods and services they export are part of a very big range. And also the trading partners, the exporting entities, are also numerous. And finally, and very importantly, technological infrastructure. That is essentially, if we take a step back, the way that we create value-added exports. The second pillar is the societal pillar. The societal pillar captures social factors like human capital development. And this, in essence, tries to contribute the economy's capacity to trade over the long term. What do we find here? We study labor standards and we study education. And essentially, we try in the societal pillar to focus into two different areas. The one area is social factors that essentially enhance the capacity to trade. What are New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the rest of the economies that concentrate in the top position? Actually, with that respect, and you're not going to be surprised, these economies have a very good educational system, attainment of education that is years that people spend in school is very high. They have high labor standards, that is labor rights, that is gender equality. And very importantly, they have a very good healthcare system. We proxy that with life expectancy. So these are economies that have long-lived people there. But in the societal pillar, we are very interested in another component, which is very, very important. And this is how people in a particular economy support this trade expansion. And nowadays, we know that this is a very important component over the last few years. What do we see there? We see that the countries that concentrate on the top have actually, they're more equal with respect to income. They have a political stability in their working. And finally, they have low levels of human exploitation. And here is what Cheng Wei said before over modern slavery, over human trafficking, and so on and so forth. And finally, we have the environmental pillar. And the environmental pillar is essentially an area where we try to measure how does an economy use its own natural resources? And furthermore, how does this economy manage the externalities of its economic activity? And part of the economic activity, of course, is trade. Right? Here, what do we find? We find actually that countries that engage in an environmentally sustainable way, like New Zealand, UK, Mexico, Japan, the Philippines, are actually the countries that score very, very high in areas like air and water pollution. They have very low levels. In areas like low carbon emissions, in how they manage the share of natural resources to their own exports. And finally, and very importantly, and COP27 is here to remind us that, whether they participate in international environmental agreements. So these three pillars actually gives us a very, very good framework to think about how these economies actually manage to cope with all the idiosyncrasies of balancing growth on the one hand and sustainability, that is social development and environmental sensitivity on the other hand. Here I'm just including the final ranking, the overall ranking that we have, which we will be publishing annually from now on. And as you see, the top 5 economies are all they are developed economies. However, and this is something that we should underline, the importance of this kind of rankings is not to basically find the economy that ranks first and everybody else in some ways loses. No, the important issue here, and this is what we try to provide to public and private sector decision makers, is where does one economy begin from and where does this economy want to go? And be able actually to benchmark what is doing throughout this, journey. From the from Europe, we have United Kingdom. There was a question in the chat. And again, the important issue here is that we measure countries that are part of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, that are part of the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. In addition to that, we're including Ecuador and United Kingdom that have applied to be part of the CPTPP, and some very important players of the region, like India, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And on that note, I think I will stop. I turn the microphone back to you, Chun-Wei, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Christos. That was a great overview of the index, and it's really interesting that what you're telling us is that it's not what the index teaches us. It is that it is not how much you trade, but how well you trade. That are the main lessons that we're drawing from the index. And as you mentioned, some of the findings include for economies that do well are those that encourage tech innovation. They have low trade barriers, that people go to school for longer periods, they have more opportunities to move up in life, they conserve energy at home, they respect climate deals abroad. So those are the sort of commonalities which you're pointing out, right? That was a really useful introduction. It would be really great to understand from Steve some of the policy implications of these findings, because so much of it is of use to policymakers all around the world, and it's a good opportunity to walk us through that. Steve?
Well, thank you very much, Chun-Wei, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, as the case might be. And a big thank you to Christos for providing us with such a clear and comprehensive overview of both the structure and the rankings from this year's index. Thank you very much. Chun-Wei, in terms of your question about policy implications, I suppose the short answer is that we're certainly facing some significant challenges, but at the same time, there are at least some reasons to be at least a bit cautiously optimistic. In terms of the challenges that we're facing, I think the first thing I would draw your attention to is the deteriorating macroeconomic environment. Certainly rising inflation, the prospects that some of the major economies in the world might be tipping into recession, if in fact they've not already tipped into recession. And we also identified a very disturbing trend in this year's index, and that's the fact that we're seeing an increase in tariff and non-tariff barriers, especially among some of the larger, more developed economies. Now, this increase in trade barriers is both a reflection of and a contributor to the high levels of dysfunction that we're currently seeing in the global trading system. Of course, our rules-based global trading system that was established in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War has been a primary driver of economic development and rising standards of living for more than 7 decades now. But unfortunately, that system is under greater pressure, is under greater stress than we've ever seen before. And there are real questions about whether or not, or the extent to which this system can continue. Now, we need to be very clear, and we need to recognize that we can't have sustainable trade unless we have a solid, stable, rules-based global trading system. So we need to restore trust and confidence, but unfortunately, frankly speaking, the prospects are somewhat dim. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, is of course the cornerstone of the rules-based global trading system, and it was founded with 2 primary responsibilities. One was to act as a global trade referee, and the other was to be the primary vehicle for driving forward trade and investment liberalization. Now, in terms of that first area of responsibility, global trade referee, the WTO has been almost entirely derailed as a result of an impasse over the appointment of appellate body judges. But I would hasten to add that even if we could wave a magic wand and we could resolve the impasse tomorrow and wake up and find the dispute settlement mechanism functioning perfectly, I would argue that the WTO still cannot be an effective global trade referee because the global trade rulebook is hopelessly out of date. Now, in terms of the second area of responsibility for the WTO, to be a vehicle to drive trade and investment liberalization forward, unfortunately, the relationships among so many WTO members are so divisive, the points of view and the priorities are so divergent that no one is even seriously considering or talking about the possibility of another multilateral round. And there's a lot of talk that there might not ever be another round of successful multilateral trade and investment negotiations commenced and concluded. So this leaves open the possibility, are we moving back more in the direction of the pre-1948 system, more law of the jungle, trade wars, and trade relationships breaking down? If so, I think we've got to recognize that this substantial dysfunction that we're seeing today in the global trade system is a real impediment to trade sustainability. And so fixing that system has got to be an important part of our sustainable trade agenda moving forward. Now, the third point that I want to draw your attention to is a very, very, very specific detail, almost a nitty-gritty detail that emerged from the index, but it really jumped out at me as being important, and I think a lot of you will find it important as well. And that is the role of large developed economies, perhaps even the complicity of large developed economies in modern day slavery. Now, most of the large developed economies that we looked at actually did quite well in terms of their labor standards within their own borders. They generally adhered to high labor standards. However, this was undercut substantially by the fact that many of them import a large number of products that are at risk of modern day slavery. So although modern day slavery might not exist within their own borders, through their import patterns, they are stoking global demand for these types of products that oftentimes rely on modern day slavery. This is an extremely crucial point. It's worth dialogue, it's worth discussion. It's not getting the attention it deserves. And we hope that by highlighting it in our Sustainable Trade Index, we might encourage more dialogue and conversation on this important issue. Christos, would you be kind enough to move us to the next slide? The fourth issue I'd like to talk to you a bit about, the impact of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. I actually want to approach with a certain amount of sensitivity because we understand that both of these events have created tremendous human suffering. So it feels a bit uncomfortable for me. It feels a bit ungracious for me to talk about the silver lining or any benefits that might have accrued as a result of pandemic and war. But from the narrow perspective of sustainable trade, there actually have been some beneficial outcomes. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine have reminded us that we have perhaps grown a little bit complacent in our approach to international trade, that we have perhaps allowed the pendulum to swing a little bit too far in the direction of seeking economic efficiencies across extended and sometimes precarious global supply chains. And so the pandemic was a very useful reminder that trade across these extended supply chains can not only bring economic benefit and economic development, that it can also increase risk and vulnerability, as we saw with so many of the painful supply chain disruptions we've wrestled with and continued to wrestle with. So as a result of this, we're seeing a number of economies very consciously and deliberately recalibrating their approach to trade, seeking more balance in their trading relationships, more balance in terms of their export markets, greater diversity in terms of where they source various critical goods from. And this is these are real cornerstone principles of trade sustainability. So it's certainly a positive step that we're seeing countries move in this direction. Now, I should also point out that unfortunately, there is a danger here. And that is because this move towards greater trade sustainability was driven by urgent externalities, the pandemic and the war. And we see oftentimes in life, not just among countries, but with human beings as well, that as soon as the storm passes, as soon as the urgency passes, we sometimes have a tendency to lapse back into some of our bad old habits. And so that's something for us to really keep an eye on moving forward, that we don't make that mistake of lapsing back into some of those overly concentrated trade relationships that we previously had. Now, I would suggest that one way to do this is to really embed the concept of trade sustainability. And that's something that we hope that the STI will make some contribution there in embedding the importance of pursuing and fostering greater trade sustainability. The sixth and final point, and I'll really just briefly make a few brief allusions here, and then invite all of you to dig into this more deeply in the index itself. But I'd like to mention a word or two about underperformers and overperformers on the Sustainable Trade Index. Now, broadly speaking, we note that our index largely tracks with income levels. So you have a tendency to see the richer countries towards the top and the poorer countries towards the bottom. But what can sometimes tell a very interesting story is when we see countries that either underperform or overperform their income level. So as an example, one important underperformer is the United States of America. Its GDP level is number 2, but its ranking in the index is number 9. So we would consider that to be an underperformance by 7 spots, by 7 places on the part of the United States. Now, one of the key factors that drag down the score of the United States, and I don't think this will come as a shock or a surprise to any of you, but is the large number of tariff and non-tariff measures that the United States has put into place. So if the U.S. wanted to become more serious about its trade sustainability, taking a look at some of those tariff and non-tariff barriers might not be a bad place to start. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the Philippines. And the Philippines was sort of a star performer, an overperformer, outperforming its GDP level by 11 spots. Now, what is the Philippines doing right? Well, much of the Philippines' strong performance was driven by a strong performance specifically on the environmental pillar. The Philippines ranked number 5 overall on the environmental pillar. That was driven by its relatively small ecological footprint and the fact that it adheres to high environmental standards in its trading relationships. So on that, at least somewhat upbeat and encouraging note, I think I'll draw my comments to a close, and I'll look forward to any comments or questions any of you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was a really comprehensive walk through the policy implications. And I think it's really, really interesting that you pointed out the underperformance issue, and particularly for the US. And it really, there's truth that you really need to dig into the index to find out why a certain economy that you might think of typically as a big, strong economy with certain economic attributes, it doesn't quite come out that way in the ranking. And you really need to drill down into the indicators to understand why. And it's really great that, Steve, you touched on modern slavery. I think that's another indicator that Christos put into the index that is really interesting, very modern, very reflective of consumer demands in this modern age, and something that is very relevant as we develop traceability and visibility on our supply chains. So you're absolutely right, Steve. We're sort of coming into this during very challenging times for global trade. And, it might be a good juncture to kind of introduce that the Hinrich Foundation is a philanthropy that seeks to advance sustainable global trade. And the idea of sustainable, the basis of it is mutually beneficial, because we believe that trade and trust are expressions of each other, and that to trade, you have to trust someone. So based on that belief, and the issues that you mentioned earlier, Steve, it is tough times for global trade. People don't trust each other anymore. People are weaponizing trade. The WTO is falling apart. It is a difficult time to be trading. It is, however, quite a timely moment as well. And I think, Christos, you mentioned this during our chat yesterday. It's kind of quite timely for the STI to be coming out right now, because we happen to be in COP27 season. The climate is on everybody's thoughts, and everyone's talking about climate change. At the same time, our Sustainable Trade Index is coming out. And it's really about how developed and developing economies interact. How do you relate STI to this particular conversation?
Yes, thank you, Trin-Wei. This is a very interesting question. I think that what we try to accomplish here is to provide the ability to people in decision-making positions, both in the public sector and in the private sector, to be able to compare and contrast, to be able to place the position of a particular economy, place the position of a particular industry, or place the position of a particular firm vis-a-vis similar or economies that perform exceptionally well, and see in essence what are the things that can be adapted, what are the things that actually an economy needs to move around in order to accomplish something. As a whole, I believe, we offer to decision makers the capacity to compare, and actually the capacity to compare in two ways. And this comes in the distinction that you made between developing and developed economies. It is obvious that the starting points are different. However, given that we are facing with a global issue, the end point is the same. And in many ways, what one tries to accomplish is tries to understand what are the strengths and what are the areas that an economy can improve upon. And I believe that our contribution is actually to offer some numbers and some positions and a framework which can be complementary to all the other type of information that people who are right now in Egypt have to decide the path that they will take.
Could I, Chunwei, could I quickly pick up on a couple of the good points that Christos made? I think the other thing that I'd add on to what Christos mentioned is that I think the index demonstrates to us the importance of breaking out of siloed thinking. When I first started my career as a trade negotiator in 1986, we could have never imagined the variety of issues that are now being brought into the trade discussion. But this is progress. This is just a reflection that we're now recognizing how interwoven environmental issues are with social issues, with economic issues, with trade issues, and that you can't segregate these things out, and that you have to approach them in a much more holistic way. And then, of course, as the index really demonstrates, seek a balance. Seek a balance. You cannot simply pursue economic growth at all costs through international trade. It is not sustainable. It's not going to work out. So I think that's certainly part of the discussion that's taking place in COP. And I think it's an important message that emerges from the STI. These issues are intertwined, and you've got to make intelligent decisions about trade-offs and seek balance above all.
Right. Those are excellent points. We are going to go off-piste a little bit right now, and well, just a little bit, because the questions are piling up from the audience. And there's one interesting one here about Brexit and how Brexit might have impacted our index, and particularly UK trade. Was that a factor that might have been reflected perhaps in the, I would guess it would be in the economic pillar? I mean, Christos and Steve, you're both well qualified to address this. So I don't know who might want to go first. Christos, you want to take a stab at it first?
So there is an easy answer to that. And the answer is that unfortunately, this is the first time that we have this we constructed this comprehensive index. This is in some ways the first time that we have all the variables that we are using here and all the countries that we are using here. So we do not have the capacity to really see how this affected. The other thing is that one, in order to do that, needs to go back and see before 2016 how this affected. Brexit must have, of course, repercussions. The main repercussions would be between United Kingdom and European Union. And because precisely both of these entities as a whole were a very big component of each other's trade, the effect over there has been actually is something that is discussed even now. But the Brexit per se was not related with a trade, but the relationship of United Kingdom vis-a-vis Europe, the European Union as a whole, right? Now, this will have two effects. One would think that the trade between EU and United Kingdom is decreasing, but at the same time, the trade between United Kingdom and not European Union economies must increase. We don't have, at least here in this ranking, we do not have the information to answer this question.
Right.
If I could just add to that, I think that's absolutely right, Christos. And the only thing that I would add to it is to say, I think if anything, it's probably a little bit too early to tell, because anytime we see a major shift like this, do not expect to see immediate results, immediate consequences, and to be able to draw immediate conclusions. I'm often asked, media, other people, a year after a free trade agreement has been put into effect, well, Steve, what was the impact of this free trade agreement? And my standard response is, I need another 15 years. You know, you really have to see the implications of this play out over time. And particularly with trade agreements, the provisions sometimes aren't even fully operative for 10, 15, or 20 years, but there's this pressure. Well, what was the impact? What was the impact of an agreement or Brexit? So I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's something we'll keep a close eye on in the future, but I wouldn't expect necessarily we'd be able to identify too many concrete outcomes this early in the game, at least.
Yeah. So yeah, I completely agree. It's essentially one might imagine that you would be able to see it in the indicators at some point. However, the STI is about more than just how singular events push a country up or down. It really covers a much broader range of factors, including how the society lives, how it educates itself, and how it treats energy and various aspects like that. So it's a little hard to sort of take one current affairs development and to see an instant reflection right away in the index. Thanks very much, guys. So I thought this might be a good opportunity to get back to that issue that Steve raised earlier about modern slavery. And Steve, you're free to expand on it, on your thoughts on it later. But first, I want to ask Christos, because in the construction of the index, I think you had told me before that you guys were really, trying to figure out like what new indicators do we put into this index, and this was one of them. And I think it would make a really interesting story if you shared with people how it came to be there and how you constructed it.
Thank you. Yes, when we were thinking about the construction of the index, and especially we were discussing in particular the societal pillar, the human development, we in essence think about elements that enhance the development of people. But at the same time, there are different elements that try to push this down actively. And from all the reports that we are going through, modern slavery is one of them. Now, modern slavery does not have a clear definition, does not have an easy way to identify it. In fact, since slavery is not legal, obviously, modern slavery, that is the control over what people can produce with respect of goods and services, is illegal. And as every illegal act is very difficult to identify. So we thought on the one hand that it's extremely important to include it, and also extremely important to include how different governments attempt to battle this ill. And we were lucky. There are some estimates that essentially are discussing about 48 million people being identified as being part of modern slavery, that is providing labor services either under force, fraud, or coercion. This is essentially the big umbrella, right? Okay. And we relied in estimates that are provided from the US Bureau of International Labor Affairs and from the Global Slavery Index that offers estimates and offers the model that they try to that they use in order to try to come up with these numbers.
It's super interesting. I mean, it's something that once companies develop their vision, the ability to track their shipments and understand their supply chains, the provenance of what they put into their products, things like that are just going to become more and more important.
Indeed, and there were a couple of questions I saw in the chat. How does one find out? And of course, it is extremely difficult. It is something that it is very difficult, especially if we are speaking about a long supply chain, where maybe you can control what's going on in the immediate previous step, but if you go 10 steps down the line, it will be almost impossible. And I want to say, and for this I go back to what Stephen said before, I want to say that essentially discussions that are taking place right now in different areas, for instance, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was discussed only September, they try to establish something like a green certificate that essentially will verify what exactly is going on with the production of goods and services.
Right. It's really interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
If I could just tack on a couple of quick thoughts. I think this issue is important and fascinating. And as I said, I hope it starts to get a lot more attention. It's interesting to me because I think this issue really reflects the confluence of two broad sort of macro trends taking place. One is the increased importance of values and discussions about what are our values and how should our values inform and impact our trading relationship. Again, something that when I was starting my career wasn't even remotely on anybody's mind, but now is really coming front and center into trade discussions. And then it kind of crosses path with this other phenomenon we're all so very familiar with, and that is social media. Right. Because we live in an age now where somebody breaks out a cell phone on a factory floor and, posts on Facebook a 35-second clip of some labor practices that are egregious or whatever the case might be. And in 24 hours, the company at the end of that supply chain might be facing a global boycott. So this is unprecedented. This is new. Consumers never, the ability of people in one part of the world to say, hey, here's the reality of how I make your running shoes, and then have consumers in developed world markets around the world be informed about that and be able to organize boycotts, put pressure, whatever the case might be. It's really a very unique time. So this combination of values now being put in front and center with the ability of social media to disseminate information about the reality of working conditions, I think this issue is only going to become more and more important over time.
Right. That's a really astute observation. And that's one of the things that I really love about this STI, because it's got really modern things in it. It's very current, and it takes into account all these very new evolving tastes, which, as you say, Steve, decades, like 2 decades ago, it just wouldn't have been it wasn't an issue at all. And now it is, and it's just going to amp up faster than any of us expect. And this is a good opportunity for me to address a question from the floor. Is it possible to download the presentation or get access to it? Yes, you can do it on both the IMD as well as the Hinrich Foundation website. I don't have the full addresses, but I believe it's imd.org, right? Christos, and hinrichfoundation.com. And when you get to the website, you'll see that there's a range of assets. There's the main report itself. There is an interactive index, which I really urge everyone to download. It is a really fun piece of technology, which IMD developed, and you can use it to see how the indicators interact with each other. It's fascinating. I urge everyone to look at it. We also have economy profiles, 30 of them for each of the economies that we covered. So we'll flash the QR codes at the end of the session. We are unfortunately bumping up against time, and we have barely begun to scratch the surface. I think we can take a couple more questions. Let me just ask both of you this. What is the future of the STI? I mean, in terms of fine-tuning and evolution, where do you see it going? Let's start with Christos and then go to Steve.
Yes, thank you. I think that obviously we will fine-tune that with all the comments and all the work that we will be doing for next year. But at the same time, obviously, there will be an element of expanding. And I feel that the expansion will take place in two dimensions. The one dimension is data. And hopefully, we will have more data over the things that we already capturing. And more, I mean, more clear, reliable, robust, and also more accurate. The other issue is that technology is working in the side of environmental sensitivity very, very much, and also on social aspects. If we think about technological improvements in the environmental pillar, for instance, from capturing the CO2 to reflecting the rays of the solar and therefore trying to decrease the temperature on Earth, these are things that may look very far away, but as soon when they come and much smaller, what do we do with one-use plastics, for instance? All these are elements that we can use. So this is the data expansion. And naturally, as it is obvious, and as the questions that we receive reflect, we are dealing with an issue that it is global. The intersection between trade and sustainability, it's not an issue of a particular country, an issue of a particular region. It is really a global issue. And therefore, expanding with respect to countries will definitely be probably in the floor. Right.
It's really interesting. And you're doing it at the same time as you're doing the World Competitiveness Ranking, am I right?
Correct.
Right.
In the World Competitiveness Ranking, we deal with 65 economies around the world, yes.
Okay, yeah, that's going to play off each other. Steve, any thoughts on that question?
Well, for whatever it's worth, I'll just share a humble personal opinion. What I'd like to see happen is for us to take all of this really good work that's been done by Christos and his team and the team at the Hinrich Foundation and all the wealth of insights and information that's contained in the Sustainable Trade Index and really find ways to leverage it more powerfully into policy discussions, into corporate boardrooms, so that we really have an opportunity to influence policy decision-making and business. We've got a great product here. We just need to get it in front of more people. And I certainly hope that the people who are kind enough to join us for today's session will give us a hand with that and share it extensively with their networks. That would be my personal hope, at least.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. It will be a great way to go. So thank you, Christos, and thank you very much, Steve. And thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. That's a wrap from us. You can download all the STI assets by scanning the QR codes that are going to appear on your screens right now. And a recording of today's session will be uploaded to our websites, both IMD and Hinrich Foundation, by the end of the week. Thank you everyone for joining the webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Greetings. Bye.